Blackthorn Manor stood as a monument to human dominance in the aftermath of the Great Wolf Wars. A sprawling estate of dark stone and iron gates that housed 3 generations of the Blackthorn family, descendants of the war heroes who had driven the werewolf kingdoms back beyond the northern mountains. The manor was more than just a noble residence. It was a symbol, a reminder carved in stone and mortar that humanity had triumphed over the supernatural threat that had once terrorized the land. Though the wars had ended 8 years ago with a fragile treaty that neither side truly trusted, Blackthorn Manor maintained its vigilance, its lord ever watchful for any sign that the beasts might return. The estate sprawled across vast lands worked by human servants, many of them spoils of the war itself. Orphans, displaced villagers and captured souls from raided settlements who had nowhere else to go. They toiled in the kitchens, the stables, the gardens and the great halls, their lives measured in service to masters who viewed them as barely more than property. It was a gilded prison where nobility feasted on delicacies while those who prepared the meals survived on scraps, where silk and velvet adorned the halls above while rags clothed the bodies of those who cleaned them. But it was in the forbidden west wing of Blackthorn Manor, where even the boldest servants feared to tread, that the darkest secret of the estate was kept. Behind doors reinforced with iron and inscribed with protective runes lay a chamber that had been specially constructed during the height of the wars. A containment cell designed to hold the most dangerous of captured creatures. The walls were built of stone 3 feet thick with no windows to let in light or hope. The air inside was perpetually cold and heavy with the scent of blood and suffering that had seeped into the very stones over the years. And there, in that place abandoned by mercy and compassion, a magnificent werewolf had been imprisoned for 5 long years. The wolf was a creature of terrible beauty, even in his tormented and bound state. His fur was a lustrous silver gray that caught what little light filtered through the iron door like moonlight on water, and his eyes were the color of molten amber, bright, burning, and filled with an intelligence that was impossible to deny. He was enormous, larger than any natural wolf had the right to be, standing nearly as tall as a man at the shoulder, and even weakened and restrained by the cursed chains that bound him. There was something about his bearing that commanded respect and inspired instinctive fear in equal measure. The chains that held him were not ordinary iron. They were forged by witch hunters in the final years of the war, imbued with dark magic specifically designed to torture werewolf flesh. Where the metal touched his body, around his powerful neck, his front legs and his back haunches, the cursed iron burned constantly, never allowing the wounds to heal. The skin beneath was raw and weeping, scarred by years of unending agony. The chains sparked and hissed whenever the wolf moved, as if the very metal delighted in his suffering, releasing wisps of smoke that carried the sickening smell of burning flesh. The guards who were occasionally forced to check on the prisoner did so with poorly concealed terror, never venturing closer than the doorway, never making eye contact with those golden eyes that seemed to see through to their very souls. They would peer through the iron bars, verify that the creature still lived, and retreat as quickly as possible, muttering prayers of protection under their breath. No one in Blackthorn Manor knew the truth of who the wolf truly was. To Lord Aldrich Blackthorn and his household, the creature was simply a prized trophy from the wars, a beast captured during the final campaigns, kept as a living testament to human victory over the supernatural. He was the Great Wolf of the North, a monster displayed to visiting nobles who wished to see proof that the werewolf threat had been conquered. Lord Blackthorn spoke periodically of executing the creature in a grand public spectacle, of making an example that would be talked about across the human kingdoms for generations. But for now, the wolf simply languished in his chains, slowly dying in the darkness, forgotten by everyone except the person tasked with keeping him barely alive. That person was Isabella Eastclaw, a young woman of 23 who worked in the kitchens of Blackthorn Manor. Isabella was a war orphan, her entire village destroyed in a raid when she was only 15 years old. She had been captured along with a dozen other survivors and brought to the manor as property, a word that made her stomach turn but that she had learned to accept as the reality of her existence. She had been given the name Eastclaw by the manor's records keeper, a cruel joke about her village's location in the Eastern Territories where the werewolf clans had once roamed free. For 8 years, Isabella had existed in the shadows of the manor, moving through her duties with the quiet efficiency expected of the enslaved. She worked primarily in the kitchens, where her natural skill with herbs and cooking had earned her a small measure of protection from the worst abuses. It was exhausting work that left her hands perpetually raw and her back aching, but Isabella had learned long ago not to complain. Complaining meant the whip, and the whip meant scars, and scars meant you were marked as rebellious. So she kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to dream of a life beyond the manor's walls. 3 months ago everything had changed. Isabella had been falsely accused of stealing a silver bracelet from Lady Margot Blackthorne, the lord's vindictive daughter who took pleasure in tormenting the servants. Isabella knew she was innocent, she had never even seen the bracelet, but innocence meant nothing without power to defend it. She was dragged before Overseer Garrett, a brutal man who enforced discipline with enthusiastic cruelty, and given a choice that was no choice at all. Accept 20 lashes with the iron-tipped whip, or take on the task that every other servant had refused. Feed the beast in the West Wing for 1 month. Isabella, who had seen what the whip did to human flesh, who had heard the screams echoing through the servants' quarters when someone was punished, chose the beast. At least, she reasoned through her terror, the death would be quick. A wolf would simply kill her and it would be over. Better than surviving the lashes only to die days later from infection or injury. That first night, as Garrett led her through the darkened corridors toward the forbidden West Wing, Isabella's entire body trembled with fear. The stories she had heard since childhood about werewolves painted them as monsters without souls, demons in the shape of beasts who killed for pleasure and fed on human flesh. She expected to walk into that cell and meet her end at the jaws of a rabid creature. But when Garrett shoved her through the iron door, locked it behind her, and she found herself standing in the dim torchlight facing the chained wolf, what Isabella felt in that terrible moment wasn't the expected fear. It was something she hadn't felt in 8 years. Recognition. The wolf lay on the cold stone floor, his magnificent body reduced to a shadow of what it should have been. Isabella could see every rib beneath his silver-gray fur, could see how the cursed chains had carved deep wounds into his flesh that wept with blood and infection. His breathing was labored, each inhale seeming to cost him tremendous effort. This was no raging monster. This was a living being in profound agony. Slowly, moving with the careful precision born of years of avoiding notice, Isabella approached the iron bars that separated her from the wolf. In her shaking hands she held a wooden bowl containing stale bread crusts and a tin cup of water that looked questionable at best. This was what she had been given to feed him. Rations meant to keep a creature alive, but only just barely. The wolf lifted his great head to look at her, and Isabella's breath caught in her throat. His eyes were the color of liquid gold, burning with an inner fire that seemed impossible in something so close to death. They were intelligent eyes. Not the eyes of an animal, but the eyes of someone who understood, who saw, who knew. And in them, Isabella saw something that shook her to her very core. Not hatred or hunger or the mindless fury she had been taught to expect. She saw suffering. She saw dignity. She saw a silent plea that reached across the space between them and wrapped around her heart like a physical touch. Isabella set the bowl and cup on the floor, sliding them carefully through a gap in the bars. Her hands were shaking so badly that water slopped over the rim. The wolf didn't move, didn't lunge, didn't make any threatening sound. He simply watched her with those impossibly intelligent golden eyes, and Isabella found she couldn't look away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I'm so sorry." She didn't know why she was apologizing or even what she was apologizing for. Sorry that this was all the food she had to give? Sorry that he was chained and suffering? Sorry for whatever had brought him to this terrible place? Perhaps it was all of it, a grief for the fundamental wrongness of what she was witnessing that had no single source. The wolf continued to watch her, and for a long moment, nothing else existed except that golden gaze and the strange sensation blooming in Isabella's chest. Something she couldn't name, something that felt almost like coming home after a long journey through darkness. Then Garrett's harsh voice echoed through the corridor outside. "Get moving, girl. The beast won't eat with you gawking at it." Isabella tore her gaze away, stumbling backward toward the door. As Garrett let her out and locked the iron barrier behind her, she glanced back one more time. The wolf had not moved toward the food. He was still watching her, his head held high despite the chains, despite the pain, despite everything. And Isabella knew with a certainty that terrified her, that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't possibly understand. In the days that followed, Isabella made her nightly journey to the West Wing, always bringing the meager rations she was provided. Stale bread, murky water, occasionally a few withered vegetables. And each night she found herself staying a little longer, lingering beyond what was strictly necessary, watching the wolf from the safe distance of the iron bars. She began to notice things that no one else seemed to have observed. How the wolf never touched his food until she had left, as though he had too much pride to show weakness before a witness. How he watched her with those penetrating golden eyes, following her every movement, but never once growling or snapping or showing aggression. How sometimes when she spoke softly to him, nervously filling the silence with meaningless words about her day, about the weather, about nothing at all, his ears would perk forward as if he were listening, truly listening to every word. It was in the second week that Isabella made a decision that could have gotten her severely punished, perhaps even killed if anyone discovered what she was doing. The rations designated for the werewolf prisoner were deliberately insufficient. Bread too stale to serve to the guards, water from the barrels near the stables that was meant for livestock, scraps that even the hunting dogs wouldn't eat. It was sustenance meant to keep something alive, but in a state of constant weakness, ensuring the creature posed no threat. And Isabella, watching how the wolf grew thinner each day, how his magnificent coat lost its luster, how those golden eyes grew dimmer with pain and starvation, felt something in her soul rebel against the cruelty. So she began to smuggle better food from the kitchens. A piece of meat from the leftovers hidden beneath the stale bread. Fresh apples that were slightly bruised for the nobles' tables but still perfectly good. Clean water from her own canteen instead of the murky liquid she was supposed to provide. It wasn't much, she had to be careful, had to take only what wouldn't be missed, but it was something. It was an act of defiance so small that no one else would have called it brave. But for Isabella, who had spent 8 years doing exactly as she was told, it felt like revolution. The wolf noticed immediately. On the night Isabella first brought him fresh meat, she saw the way his nostrils flared, how his eyes widened slightly with something that might have been surprise. He waited as always until she had backed away to the door. But this time when he ate, Isabella stayed to watch. And she saw the careful, almost reverent way he consumed the food, as if it were the most precious thing he had ever received. From that night forward something shifted between them. The wolf began to respond to her presence in subtle ways. A slight movement of his tail when she entered, a soft rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl but something else, something almost like a greeting. Isabella found herself talking to him more, sharing stories of her life before the manor, her memories of family, her quiet dreams of freedom. And though she told herself she was being foolish, though she knew that wolves couldn't understand human speech, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that he understood every word. That behind those golden eyes was someone, not just something. That she was not feeding a mindless beast, but communicating with a prisoner who had simply lost his ability to speak. It was the beginning of a bond that would change everything. Though neither of them knew it yet, the seeds of revolution were being planted in the darkness of that cell, watered by compassion and cultivated by the most powerful force in existence. The recognition of shared suffering and the choice to ease it, even at great personal cost. The chains would not hold forever. The darkness would not last. And the maid who saw beyond fangs and fur was about to discover that sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world is not the monster you've been taught to fear, but the act of radical kindness in a place designed for cruelty. Before we enter the forbidden West Wing and witness Isabella's first encounter with the chained Alpha King, I need you to do something for me. If this story has already captured your imagination, if you can feel the pull of the soul bond forming between a slave and a king, then join the pack. Hit that like button to show your support. It tells me you're ready for this journey into darkness and redemption. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of this story or the next tale of forbidden love and shattered chains I have waiting for you. And here's something special. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Are you in the moonlit forests of the north? The sun-baked lands of the south? I want to know where my pack is gathering, because this story, Isabella and Marcus's story, is for all of us who believe that compassion can break even the strongest chains. Now let the story begin. The silver bracelet gleamed mockingly on Lady Margot's dressing table as Isabella stood trembling before Overseer Garrett, her protests dying in her throat. She had never even touched the cursed thing, but Lady Margot's word was law, and a slave's denial was worth less than the dirt beneath their feet. 20 lashes, Garrett announced, his weathered face betraying a hint of satisfaction as he fingered the iron-tipped whip hanging from his belt. Or you can take old Edith's task. Feed the beast in the West Wing for 1 month. His smile was cruel. Your choice, girl. Isabella's mind raced through terrible calculations. She had seen what the whip did to Sarah last winter. The girl had died 3 days later, fever burning through her torn flesh. But the wolf. Everyone said the wolf was death itself, that it had killed 2 guards who ventured too close, that it could tear a person apart in seconds. Yet death would be quick, wouldn't it? Quicker than bleeding out on the servants' floor while Lady Margot watched and smiled. The wolf, Isabella whispered. I'll feed the wolf. Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly as if he hadn't expected her to choose. But he nodded, grabbed her roughly by the arm, and dragged her through the manor's winding corridors as twilight bled the last light from the windows. The forbidden west wing loomed before them, its walls darker, colder, emanating something that made Isabella's skin crawl with instinctive warning. The iron door was covered in runes she couldn't read, symbols that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. Garrett produced a massive key and the lock opened with a sound like breaking bones. He shoved her inside, thrusting a wooden bowl of moldy bread crusts and a tin cup of murky water into her shaking hands. Set it through the bars and get out. Don't look at it. Don't speak to it. And pray it doesn't take interest in you. The door slammed shut behind her, the lock clicking with terrible finality. The chamber was dark except for a single guttering torch. Isabella's eyes adjusted slowly and then she saw him. The wolf was massive beyond reason, his body sprawling across the stone floor despite the cursed chains that bound him. Silver-gray fur, matted with dried blood and dirt, rose and fell with labored breathing. The chains sparked and hissed where they touched his flesh, burning with a sickly light that made her stomach turn. This was torture pure and simple. Not containment. Not justice. Just endless, deliberate cruelty. She took a trembling step forward, then another, drawn by something she couldn't name. The wolf lifted his head and Isabella froze. His eyes were molten amber, burning with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so broken. They locked onto hers, hazel meeting gold, and the world tilted sideways. Isabella's breath caught in her chest as something surged through her. A recognition so profound it felt like memory, like déjà vu, like coming home after a century of wandering lost in darkness. She knew those eyes. Impossible, insane, but she knew them. The wolf didn't snarl. Didn't lunge. He simply watched her with an intelligence that was devastatingly, terrifyingly human. And Isabella felt the foundations of everything she thought she knew begin to crack and crumble beneath her feet. With trembling hands she knelt and slid the bowl through the bars, the stale bread tumbling across the stone. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, words she couldn't stop. What are you? The wolf's gaze never wavered, and in the silence that followed, Isabella heard the chains spark and hiss, heard her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, and felt the first stirrings of something that would either save her or destroy her completely. Perhaps both. By the 3rd night, Isabella's hands had stopped shaking when she entered the west wing, though her heart still hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The wolf never moved when she approached, never showed aggression, never gave any indication he was the monster the guards whispered about in terrified voices. He simply watched her with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes and waited. It was that patience, that dignified restraint despite obvious starvation, that broke something open inside Isabella's chest. On the 4th night she smuggled a piece of roasted chicken from the kitchens, wrapped carefully in cloth and hidden in the deep pocket of her apron. Her heart pounded with a different kind of fear as she slipped it beneath the stale bread. Fear of being caught, yes, but more than that. Fear of what it meant that she was willing to risk punishment for a creature she'd been taught to hate. When she slid the bowl through the bars, the wolf's nostrils flared. His head lifted slightly, and Isabella saw something flicker in those golden eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Or recognition that someone had seen him as more than a monster to be starved. He waited as always until she backed away. But this time Isabella didn't leave immediately. She stayed by the door watching as he rose on trembling legs, the chains sparking viciously against his movements, and approached the food. The way he ate the chicken was almost reverent, careful, as though it were the most precious thing he'd ever received. By the 5th night, Isabella was bringing fresh water from her own canteen. By the 6th she'd stolen apples from the root cellar, her heart in her throat as she passed Garrett in the corridor, certain he could somehow see through the fabric of her apron to the contraband hidden within. She began talking to him to mask her nervousness, filling the heavy silence with meaningless chatter about the weather, about the kitchen gossip, about nothing and everything. And she noticed, really noticed, how his ears would track the sound of her voice, swiveling toward her even when his head remained still. How he seemed to listen with an attentiveness that went far beyond animal instinct. On the 7th night, Isabella stayed longer than the rules allowed. She sat with her back against the cold stone wall, watching the wolf as he lay on the floor, his breathing less labored than it had been days before. The fresh food was helping. She could see it in the slight improvement in his coat, in the way his eyes seemed brighter, more alert. "You're not what they say you are you?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, barely more than a whisper in the torchlit darkness. The wolf's ears immediately perked forward, standing at attention. His golden eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And then he made a sound, low and rumbling, emanating from deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl. It was something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like agreement, like acknowledgement, like a response to a question that demanded an answer he couldn't give in words. Isabella's pulse thundered in her ears as the truth she'd been avoiding crashed over her like a wave. This wasn't just an intelligent animal. This was someone. Someone trapped in a body that couldn't speak, bound in chains that burned, suffering in silence while the world called him monster and beast and nightmare. "Who are you?" she breathed, leaning forward despite every instinct that screamed at her to maintain distance. "What did they do to you?" The wolf held her gaze, and in the amber depths of his eyes, Isabella saw something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Understanding. Complete, devastating understanding. And she knew with a certainty that would change everything, that he had heard every word she'd ever spoken to him. Every nervous ramble, every whispered apology, every moment of kindness. He had understood it all. The question was, could he somehow make her understand him in return? The dreams began on the 8th night, and they were nothing like dreams Isabella had ever experienced before. She ran through moonlit forests on 4 powerful legs, the earth cool and alive beneath her paws. The scent of pine and wild grass filled her lungs, and all around her, wolves ran in perfect formation. A pack that moved as one living organism, bound by loyalty deeper than blood. She could feel their reverence, their devotion radiating toward her like warmth from a fire. They weren't following out of fear. They were following because they believed. Because they loved. The vision shifted, and Isabella found herself standing in a grand hall carved from pale stone and decorated with silver. Wolves in human form, tall, elegant, powerful, bowed low as a figure passed among them. A man with silver hair that caught the candlelight like starshine, his eyes burning amber gold, his presence commanding without cruelty. A king. This was a king. Then the vision darkened. She saw trusted faces, advisors she somehow knew by name, serving wine at a celebration. She saw the king drink, saw his expression shift from joy to confusion to horror as his body betrayed him. She saw chains being forged in secret fires, inscribed with runes that made her dream self recoil. She saw the moment of capture, betrayal from within, the king brought down not by enemies but by those who wore the faces of friends. Isabella woke gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat, her heart pounding with rage and grief that weren't her own. The emotions clung to her like a second skin, so vivid and overwhelming that she pressed her hands to her chest to make sure her heart was still her own. The dreams came every night after that. Each one showed her more. Fragments of a life that wasn't hers, memories that belonged to someone else bleeding into her sleeping mind like watercolors running together on canvas. By the 13th night, Isabella could no longer deny what was happening. Somehow, impossibly, she was seeing through the wolf's eyes. She was experiencing his memories, his pain, his past. On the 14th night, when she entered the west wing with fresh meat hidden in her apron, Isabella looked at the chained wolf with new understanding. She studied the scarred muzzle, the regal bearing that even chains and torture couldn't erase, the way he held himself despite everything. This wasn't just any wolf. This was someone who had once been worshipped, feared, loved. She knelt by the bars, closer than she'd ever dared, and whispered the question that had been burning in her chest since the dreams began. "Who are you?" The wolf's amber eyes locked onto hers, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then for the first time Isabella heard it, not with her ears but somewhere deeper, resonating in the space between her heartbeats. A voice like thunder and silk, ancient and weary and achingly real, speaking directly into her mind. "My name is Marcus Newmoon. I was, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Isabella's breath stopped in her lungs. The Alpha King. The legendary ruler the humans claimed had been killed in the final battle of the war. The most powerful werewolf who had ever lived, the one whose death had supposedly ended the conflict and brought humanity its victory. And I am dying, Isabella Eastclaw. He knew her name. He had spoken her name with a familiarity that made her soul ache. How long had he been listening to her rambling stories, learning the details of her life while she believed she was speaking to a creature who couldn't understand? How, she breathed aloud. How are you in my head? The wolf, Marcus, shifted slightly and she saw the pain that even small movements caused him. The chains hissed and sparked against his fur, and Isabella felt a phantom burn across her own wrists, an echo of his agony that made her gasp. The soul bond, his voice rumbled through her mind, heavy with sorrow and something that might have been wonder. It happens once in a millennium, if that. A connection between souls that transcends species, transcends everything. You felt it the first night we met. That recognition. That impossible certainty. Isabella's hands trembled as she pushed the food through the bars. I don't understand. Why me? Why now? I don't know. Fate perhaps. Or mercy. Or cruelty. A pause, and when his voice came again it was softer, more vulnerable. But the bond is growing stronger every day you come to me. Every kindness you show. And it's killing you as surely as these chains are killing me. What? Isabella pressed her hand against the cold iron bars, her heart racing with sudden fear. What do you mean? Marcus's golden eyes held hers, and in them she saw terrible knowledge, ancient and unavoidable. The soul bond ties us together, Isabella. What I feel you will begin to feel. My wounds will become phantom pains on your body. My death. His mental voice trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. His death would mean hers as well. Isabella sat back on her heels, her mind reeling. He was bound to him. Bound to a dying werewolf king, connected by something she didn't understand, drawn into a fate she never chose. She should run. Should stop coming to this cell, should break whatever connection had formed between them before it destroyed her. But even as the thought formed, she knew she wouldn't. Couldn't. Because when she looked into Marcus Newmoon's amber eyes, she didn't see a monster or a king or even a wolf. She saw the other half of her soul, and walking away would be like tearing herself in two. Then we find a way to save you, she whispered fiercely. Tell me how. Tell me what I need to do. And in the flickering torchlight of that terrible cell, as chains sparked and destiny tightened around them both, Marcus Newmoon began to speak of blood rituals, of ancient magic and of the impossible price of freedom. Isabella woke on the 15th morning with her wrists on fire. She threw back her thin blanket and stared at her skin in the pale dawn light filtering through the servants' quarters. There were no burns, no marks, nothing to explain the searing pain that radiated from her wrists up through her arms. But she knew. Through the bond that grew stronger with each passing day, she could feel Marcus's agony as if it were her own. The infections were getting worse. The cursed chains were slowly poisoning him from the inside out, and time was running out. By the 18th day, Isabella could barely concentrate on her kitchen duties. The phantom burns had spread to her neck, and every movement sent waves of sympathetic pain through her body. She dropped a tray of dishes, earning a vicious slap from the head cook, but she barely felt it. All she could feel was Marcus, dying in darkness, suffering alone. That night, she made a decision that crossed every boundary she'd ever been taught to respect. She stole medical supplies from the manor's infirmary. Clean cloth, healing salve, a bottle of strong alcohol used to clean wounds. Her hands shook as she tucked them into her apron, and her heart thundered so loudly she was certain someone would hear it and discover her theft. But somehow, miraculously, she made it to the West Wing without being caught. When she entered the cell, Marcus was barely conscious. The wounds where the chains touched his flesh had turned a sickly greenish color, weeping blood that smelled wrong, metallic and rotten at once. His breathing was shallow, labored, and his golden eyes were dimmed with fever. I'm coming in, Isabella whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Don't move. Please don't move. She had no key to the cell, but there was a small gate at the bottom of the bars, designed for sliding in food. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but Isabella was small and desperation made her brave. She squeezed through the gap, her dress catching on the rough iron, her heart in her throat. Marcus's eyes tracked her as she approached, wide with something that might have been alarm or warning. Even weakened, even dying, he could kill her in an instant. One snap of those powerful jaws, one swipe of his claws and she would be gone. But he didn't move. He lay perfectly still as Isabella knelt beside him, her shaking hands reaching for the chains. The moment her fingers touched the cursed metal, she gasped. The burns were real here. The iron sizzled against her skin and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. She pulled back, wrapping her hands in cloth before trying again. "I don't know why," she whispered as she began cleaning the infected wounds with gentle, careful movements. Her tears fell onto his silver-gray fur, darkening it. "I don't know why this is happening or what it means or why I can't just walk away. But I can't let you die, Marcus. I can't." He made a low sound, somewhere between a whimper and a rumble, and Isabella felt it resonate through the bond. Not pain this time. Gratitude. Wonder. Something perilously close to love. She worked through the night, cleaning each wound, applying the salve despite how the cursed chains fought her efforts, giving him water mixed with herbs that might help fight the infection. By the time she crawled back through the gate as dawn approached, her hands were raw and blistered, her dress was stained with blood and medicine, and her entire body trembled with exhaustion. But Marcus's breathing had steadied. The fever glaze had cleared slightly from his eyes. She had bought him time, though how much she couldn't say. That night the dream link came with an intensity that stole her breath. Marcus showed her everything. The full story, holding nothing back. She saw him in his human form, tall and powerful, with silver hair and those unmistakable amber eyes, wearing a crown of moonstone and silver. She saw his council, wolves he had trusted with his life, Dmitri his chief advisor, Elena his war general, Tobias his oldest friend. She saw them plotting in shadows, their ambition festering like rot. They wanted his power but not his vision for peace with humans. They wanted war, conquest, domination. She saw the night of betrayal in excruciating detail. The poisoned wine that didn't kill but weakened him enough for the cursed chains to be fitted. The moment Marcus realized what was happening, the horror and grief in his eyes as he looked at faces he'd loved and saw only hunger for his throne. She saw them sell him to the humans, watched as Lord Blackthorn paid in gold for the trophy that would cement his reputation as a hero of the war. And then Marcus showed her something else. A memory that wasn't his own, but passed down through generations of werewolf kings. The legend of the soul bond. Isabella saw ancient wolves gathered beneath a full moon, telling stories of the rarest magic in existence. A bond that transcended everything, species, time, distance, death itself. When two souls recognized each other across the void, when the connection formed, nothing could break it. They would share pain, share emotions, share life force. They would be bound together, two halves of one whole, until death claimed them both. The bonds were so rare that most werewolves lived entire lifetimes without witnessing one. Some believed they were myths. But Marcus's grandmother had been part of a soul bond, and she had taught him the signs. The instant recognition, the dreams, the shared pain, the inexplicable need to be near the other person despite all reason. Isabella woke with tears streaming down her face, Marcus's memories and emotions still echoing through her mind. He understood now. The bond explained everything. Why she'd felt that impossible recognition the first night, why she could hear his voice in her mind, why she felt his pain as her own, why the thought of his death felt like her own heart being ripped from her chest. They were soul bonded. Connected by a magic older than the wars, older than the hatred between their species. And that bond was the only thing keeping Marcus alive. Her life force feeding into his through the connection, sustaining him when the cursed chains should have already killed him. But it was also killing her. Every day the bond grew stronger, every day she shared more of his suffering, her own strength was being drained away. Isabella could feel it. The exhaustion that went bone deep, the way her hands trembled constantly now, the hollowness in her chest. The question wasn't whether the bond would kill them both. The question was whether they could find a way to save Marcus before it did. And time, Isabella knew with terrible certainty, was almost up. The announcement came on the 22nd day, proclaimed with fanfare and excitement that made Isabella's stomach turn to ice. Lord Aldrich Blackthorn stood in the great hall, resplendent in velvet and fur, addressing his household and visiting nobles with the enthusiasm of a man planning a grand entertainment. "The Winter Solstice Festival will be one for the history books," he declared, his voice booming off the stone walls. We shall celebrate humanity's triumph with the public execution of the great wolf of the north. Let all who fear the darkness see that we have conquered it. The hall erupted in applause. Isabella, serving wine from a silver pitcher, felt the world tilt sideways. 3 days. The execution was 3 days away. She barely made it through her duties before fleeing to the West Wing, propriety and caution abandoned. When she burst through the iron door, Marcus was already waiting, his golden eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I heard. His voice resonated through their bond, grim and weary. The whole manor is celebrating my death. I won't let them, Isabella said fiercely, falling to her knees by the bars. There has to be a way. Tell me there's a way. Marcus was silent for a long moment, and Isabella could feel his internal struggle through the bond. Hope warring with despair, desire for freedom battling against something else. Fear. Not for himself but for her. There is a way, he finally said, his mental voice heavy with terrible knowledge. The soul bond has been feeding me your life force, keeping me alive when these chains should have killed me months ago. With your help it might give me enough strength to force a transformation to break free. Then we do it, Isabella said immediately. Tell me how. Isabella. The way he said her name, full of pain and longing, made her heart clench. It requires a blood ritual. You would have to grasp the cursed chains with your bare hands while channeling your life force directly into me. The pain would be unimaginable. And there's a strong chance it would kill you. The ritual might drain you completely, leave you an empty shell. And if we don't try? Isabella demanded. You die in 3 days, and because of the soul bond I die with you. At least this way we have a chance. A chance for me, Marcus corrected, and she could feel his anguish bleeding through the bond. You could walk away right now. Stop coming here. The bond is still new enough that it might fade if you break contact. You could live, Isabella. You could survive this. As a slave, she whispered. Living in fear, serving the people who murdered you, knowing I had the chance to do something and chose safety instead. She pressed her palm against the iron bars, ignoring how the cursed metal made her skin prickle. That's not living, Marcus. That's just existing. Through the bond she felt his emotions surge. Pride, grief, love, and a desperate fear that wrapped around her heart like chains of its own. You would risk everything for someone you've known less than a month? For a werewolf? For the enemy? You're not my enemy, Isabella said simply. You're the other half of my soul. I felt it the first moment I saw you, and every day since has only made it clearer. If you die, the part of me that matters dies with you anyway. At least this way I choose my fate instead of having it chosen for me. She saw Marcus's eyes close, saw the slight tremor that ran through his body. When he opened them again, they blazed with determination and something that looked perilously close to hope. Then we do it the night before the execution, he said. When the moon is full and the bond is strongest. I'll teach you the words, show you how to channel the energy. But Isabella. His voice softened, becoming almost tender. If this works, if I break free, there's no going back. You'll be marked as a traitor, hunted by every human authority. Your life as you know it will be over. Good, Isabella said with a fierce smile that surprised her. I never wanted that life anyway. But her defiance crumbled when she left the West Wing and nearly collided with Garrett in the darkened corridor. The overseer's eyes narrowed as he took in her disheveled appearance, her pale face, the way she trembled from exhaustion. You've been spending an awful lot of time with the beast girl, he said slowly, suspicion dripping from every word. And you look worse each day. What are you doing in there? Just feeding him, sir, Isabella managed, trying to keep her voice steady. As ordered. Feeding him, Garrett repeated, not believing her for a second. He stepped closer and Isabella fought the urge to retreat. Or talking to it. Getting attached to the monster. His hand shot out, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. Lord Blackthorne would be very interested to know if one of his servants was showing inappropriate sympathy to his prize. I'm not, Isabella started, but Garrett cut her off. I'll be watching you, he said, releasing her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling. Very closely. And if I catch you doing anything other than your assigned duties, if I find any evidence of treason, well, the execution platform being built in the courtyard is big enough for two. He walked away, leaving Isabella shaking in the corridor, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with physical danger. Garrett suspected. He was watching. And in 3 days she would have to perform a ritual that would take hours, that would be impossible to hide, that would mark her forever as a traitor to her own kind. She had 3 days to prepare. 3 days to learn the ritual that might save Marcus or kill them both. 3 days before she would have to make a choice between survival and freedom, between safety and love, between the life she'd been forced into and the destiny she was choosing for herself. And somewhere in the manor above, carpenters were building an execution platform, nobles were arriving to witness the spectacle, and Lord Blackthorn was planning the entertainment that would cement his legacy. The countdown had begun, and Isabella knew with terrifying certainty that when it ended, nothing would ever be the same again. One way or another, in 3 days everything would change. The night before the execution, Isabella moved through the manor like a ghost, her heart beating a rhythm that sounded like goodbye. She stole a small knife from the kitchens, tucking it against her skin where it pressed cold and final. In the courtyard below, the execution platform stood complete, draped in black cloth that would soon be stained with blood. Guards patrolled with extra vigilance. The manor thrummed with anticipation. Isabella didn't care. She had made her choice. When she entered the West Wing for what might be the last time, Marcus was waiting. Their eyes met across the darkness and no words were needed. Through the soul bond she felt everything he couldn't say. His fear for her, his desperate hope, his love that had grown from recognition to something vast and consuming. "I'm ready," Isabella whispered. She crawled through the gate into his cell, the knife clutched in her trembling hand. Marcus watched as she knelt before him, as she pressed the blade to her palm and drew it across her skin. Blood welled up, dark and vital in the torchlight. Isabella didn't hesitate. She reached for the cursed chains with her bleeding hand. The moment her skin made contact, agony exploded through her body. The chains burned with a heat that shouldn't exist, searing through flesh toward bone. Isabella screamed, but she didn't let go. She gripped tighter, her blood running over the cursed metal, and began speaking the ancient words Marcus had taught her through their dreams. Words in a language older than kingdoms, syllables that tasted like moonlight and wild forests. The soul bond ignited between them like lightning striking dry tinder. Isabella felt her life force pouring out of her, rushing through the connection into Marcus with an intensity that stole her breath. The chains began to glow white-hot, fighting back against the magic that sought to break them. Sparks flew in cascading showers of light, and Isabella could smell her own flesh burning, but she refused to let go. Marcus howled, a sound of pure anguish that shattered the silence of the West Wing. His body convulsed, muscles spasming as something fundamental began to change. Isabella watched through dimming vision as his form started to shift, bones cracking and reshaping with sounds that made her stomach turn. "Don't stop," Marcus's voice thundered through her mind, desperate and commanding. "Isabella, don't let go." He didn't. Even as her vision darkened, even as she felt her consciousness beginning to fray at the edges, Isabella held on. The chains glowed brighter, the sparks becoming a storm of light around them. The curse fought with everything it had, trying to burn through her, trying to kill them both rather than release its prisoner. But the soul bond was older than curses, stronger than hate. And Isabella's love, reckless, absolute and freely given, was the key that no amount of dark magic could resist. With a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the chains exploded. Molten iron flew outward in a shower of sparks and light, the cursed metal finally surrendering to a power it couldn't understand. The force of the explosion threw Isabella backward, and she felt herself falling, the world spinning around her in fragments of light and shadow. But before she hit the stone floor, strong arms caught her. Arms that were human. Isabella forced her eyes open, though every part of her body screamed in protest. Through her fading vision she saw him for the first time. Marcus Newmoon in his true form. A tall man with a powerful build, sharp aristocratic features, and silver hair that fell past his shoulders like liquid moonlight. His skin was marked with scars where the chains had burned for 5 years, but he stood straight and proud, radiating a presence that made the very air around him seem to vibrate with power. His eyes were the same. Molten amber gold, burning with intelligence and emotion and something that looked like reverence as he gazed down at her. "Isabella," he said, and his voice was like thunder wrapped in silk, exactly as she'd heard it in her mind but impossibly more real. "You magnificent, reckless, beautiful soul. She tried to smile, tried to tell him they'd done it, they'd won, but darkness was rushing up to claim her. She'd given too much, poured too much of herself into the ritual. Her life force was nearly depleted, her body shutting down from the trauma. No, Marcus said fiercely, gathering her closer against his chest. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, strong and alive and free. No, you don't get to leave me now. Not after everything. Stay with me, Isabella. Stay. But the darkness was so heavy and Isabella was so tired. She let her eyes close, let herself sink into the warmth of his arms, dimly aware of Marcus calling her name with increasing desperation. The last thing she heard before consciousness left her completely was the sound of alarms beginning to blare throughout Blackthorn Manor, and Marcus's voice, no longer pleading but commanding, speaking words in that ancient language that made the very stones tremble. She had freed the Alpha King. Now he would have to save her. If he could. The alarms shrieked through Blackthorn Manor like the screams of dying things, and Marcus knew they had minutes at most before the guards converged on the west wing. He looked down at Isabella, unconscious and pale in his arms, her breath barely a whisper against his chest. She had given everything to free him. Now he would give everything to save her. 5 years of imprisonment had not been wasted. Marcus had listened, always listened to the sounds of the manor filtering through stone and iron. He knew which floorboards creaked, which corridors the guards patrolled, which passages the servants used to move unseen through the bowels of the estate. Isabella herself had told him stories during their late-night conversations, describing the hidden ways she navigated to avoid cruel masters and crueler overseers. He would use every scrap of that knowledge now. Marcus moved through the darkness with the fluid grace of a predator, even weakened as he was. The transformation had cost him, and 5 years of silver poisoning didn't disappear in an instant, but he was Alpha King. Power flowed through his veins like wildfire, building with each step, each breath of freedom. He navigated through servant passages that hadn't seen light in decades, Isabella cradled protectively against his chest. Behind them he could hear guards shouting, boots pounding on stone, Lord Blackthorn's voice bellowing orders. The entire manor was waking to the impossible reality that their prize had escaped. Marcus was almost to the outer wall when a figure stepped out of the shadows ahead, blocking the narrow passage. Garrett. The overseer's face was twisted with rage and something else. Fear perhaps, or the desperate fury of a man watching his world collapse. He held a sword that trembled in his grip. "You're not leaving," Garrett snarled. "And neither is the traitor girl." Marcus stopped, his golden eyes burning in the darkness. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of Alpha authority. "Move aside. I'll sound the alarm. I'll wake every guard in." Garrett's threat cut off as Marcus moved. He was faster than any human had the right to be, even weakened. One moment he stood several paces away, the next he was in front of Garrett, having shifted Isabella to one arm while the other caught the overseer's sword hand in an iron grip. "You've hurt her," Marcus said softly, and Garrett gasped as supernatural strength ground the bones in his wrist together. "You've hurt so many like her. Innocent people who never had a choice. She's property." Garrett spat. "She's nothing. She's everything." Marcus's voice dropped to a growl that raised every hair on Garrett's body. "And you will never touch her again." He could kill the man. Should kill him perhaps for all the suffering he'd caused. It would be easy. One twist, one moment of violence and Garrett would never hurt anyone again. Marcus felt the rage burning in his chest, 5 years of pain and humiliation and torture demanding blood as payment. But then he felt Isabella's heart beating against his chest, weak but steady. Heard her voice in his memory, "You're not what they say you are." Marcus released Garrett, shoving him backward into the wall hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. "I am not the monster you believe," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "But if you follow us, if you threaten her again, I will show you what a real monster looks like." He left Garrett gasping in the darkness and ran. The outer wall was close now. Marcus could smell the winter air, could hear the forest calling to instincts that had been chained for too long. Behind them more alarms were sounding. Garrett must have recovered enough to shout a warning. Time was up. Marcus burst through a servant's entrance into the freezing pre-dawn air, and for the first time in 5 years he was outside. The winter forest stretched before them, snow-covered and vast, offering sanctuary if they could reach it before the hunters caught them. He ran. Not at full speed, he couldn't risk jarring Isabella too much, but faster than any human could follow. The snow crunched beneath his bare feet, the cold air burned in his lungs, and freedom sang in his blood like wine. Behind them, Lord Blackthorn's hunting parties were mobilizing, hounds baying, horses being saddled, men shouting oaths of vengeance. Marcus didn't care. Let them come. Let them try to reclaim what they'd lost. He was Alpha King, and he was finally free. He was a mile into the forest when he felt Isabella stir against his chest. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and disoriented, and then focused on his face. On the trees rushing past. On the dawn light filtering through the branches above. Marcus. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough with exhaustion. Did we? We did, he said, not slowing his pace. You broke the chains. You freed me. Isabella's eyes widened as memory returned. She looked up at him, really looked at him in daylight for the first time. Took in his human form, his silver hair streaming behind him as he ran, the strength in the arms that held her. Then she looked past him at the forest, at the sky visible through the trees, at the world opening up around them. We're outside, she breathed, and something broke in her voice. I'm outside. I haven't been outside the manor walls in 8 years. Marcus felt his heart clench. 8 years as a prisoner in everything but name. 8 years of walls and masters and endless servitude. And now, despite the danger, despite the hunters pursuing them, despite not knowing what the future held, Isabella was free. We're not safe yet, Marcus warned, adjusting his grip on her. Blackthorn will send everything he has after us. We need to reach my territory, but it's days of travel north, and you need rest and healing. Isabella's hand came up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his scarred skin. Her eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. Actually smiling despite everything. I don't care, she said softly. Let them chase us. Let them try to catch us. Because right now in this moment I'm free. We're free. And Marcus, her voice caught with emotion. For the first time in my entire life I chose this. I chose you. I chose freedom over safety, love over survival. That's worth anything they can do to us. Marcus's throat tightened with emotions he couldn't name. He had been king of the most powerful werewolf nation in the north. He had commanded armies, held court, made decisions that shaped the fate of thousands. But nothing had ever felt as significant as this moment. This fragile human woman who had risked everything, sacrificed everything, to save a monster she'd been taught to fear. Then hold on, he said, beginning to run faster now that she was awake. Hold on tight, Isabella, because I'm taking you home. To my home. Where no one will ever chain you again, where you'll never have to bow to anyone, where you can finally be who you were meant to be. And who's that? Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer. She could feel it through the soul bond, burning bright and certain between them. Marcus looked down at her, his golden eyes blazing with promise and power and love that transcended every boundary they'd been taught to respect. High Queen, he said simply. The Luna Queen of the Northern Territories. The woman who saw past fangs and fur to the soul beneath. The one who broke chains that were forged to last forever. Behind them the hunting horns sounded, closer than Marcus liked. Ahead the forest grew deeper, wilder, more dangerous. They had miles to go, enemies at their backs, and an uncertain future stretching before them. But Isabella, cradled in the arms of the Alpha King as they fled into the winter dawn, felt something she'd never known before, something that made every risk worthwhile. He felt hope. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous and powerful magic of all. The journey north was measured not in miles but in transformations. Marcus grew stronger with each day away from the cursed chains, his supernatural healing knitting together wounds that had festered for 5 years. Color returned to his skin, power flooded back into his muscles, and the haunted look in his golden eyes gradually gave way to something fiercer, more alive. He was becoming himself again, the Alpha King who had once commanded the loyalty of thousands. But it was Isabella's transformation that took Marcus's breath away. On the third night, camped beneath ancient pines with a fire crackling between them, Marcus explained the soul bond fully. They sat close enough to touch, close enough that Isabella could feel the heat radiating from his body, warmer than any human's. We are mates, Marcus said, his voice soft but certain. Bound by a magic older than kingdoms. What you feel I feel. Your joy is my joy. Your pain is my pain. He paused, his golden eyes searching hers in the firelight. And if one of us dies, the other follows. Not immediately, perhaps, but inevitably. The soul bond doesn't break with death. It drags both souls into whatever comes after. Isabella absorbed this in silence, watching the flames dance. She should have been terrified. Should have been angry at the choice that had been made for her by forces beyond her control. But instead she felt only a strange sense of rightness, as if some part of her had always known. "I don't regret it," she finally said. "Any of it? Even knowing you'll never be fully human again?" Marcus asked. "The bond changes you, Isabella. You'll live longer, heal faster, sense things ordinary humans cannot. You'll be caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "I've never belonged anywhere. Maybe being caught between worlds is exactly where I'm meant to be." But understanding the bond was only the beginning of her education. As they traveled, Marcus taught her about the werewolf world, the complex hierarchy of packs, the territories that stretched across the northern mountains, the culture of honor and loyalty that governed his people. Isabella listened with the intensity of someone learning the language of a country she would soon call home. On the 5th day the lessons became brutally practical. They were following a deer trail through a narrow canyon when Isabella's newly heightened senses, a gift of the soul bond, picked up something wrong. The forest had gone too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. She grabbed Marcus's arm and he froze, reading the same signs. "Ambush," he growled, his body tensing for battle. They came from all sides. 5 wolves in human form, members of Marcus's traitorous council. Isabella recognized them from the dreams. Dimitri with his cruel smile, Elena with her cold eyes, and 3 others whose loyalty had been bought with promises of power. "Hello, old friend," Dimitri said, his voice dripping with mock warmth. "We heard rumors you'd escaped. Couldn't have that now, could we? Dead kings tell no tales." Marcus stepped in front of Isabella, protective instinct overriding everything else. 5 against 1. "You always were a coward, Dimitri." 5 against 1.5, Elena corrected, her gaze flicking dismissively toward Isabella. "The human pet won't be much help. That was their mistake." Isabella had spent 8 years in Blackthorn Manor watching, learning, surviving. She knew how soldiers moved, how they thought, how they coordinated attacks. And she knew something the traitors didn't. Humans fought differently than werewolves. While Marcus's kind relied on strength and supernatural speed, humans relied on deception, on exploiting weakness, on fighting dirty. As the battle erupted, Marcus taking on 3 attackers with a ferocity that shook the very air, Isabella moved. She grabbed a fallen branch, waited for the right moment, and struck Elena from behind just as the she-wolf was preparing to attack Marcus's exposed flank. The blow wouldn't have killed a werewolf, but it was enough to stagger her, to break her concentration, to give Marcus the opening he needed. The fight was brutal and brief. Marcus, fueled by 5 years of rage and the strength of the soul bond, was unstoppable. When it was over, 2 traitors lay dead and the other 3 fled into the forest, wounded and terrified. Marcus turned to Isabella, breathing hard, blood on his hands. "You saved my life. We're bound together," Isabella said simply, though her hands were shaking. "Your life is my life. I protect what's mine." Something shifted in Marcus's expression then, pride mixing with love, respect with desire. He closed the distance between them and kissed her, fierce and claiming, a promise written in the language of touch. Isabella kissed him back, tasting blood and wildness and freedom. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "You're not the same woman who fed a chained wolf in a dungeon," he said softly. "No," Isabella agreed. "I'm not. That woman was scared and small and powerless. This woman is your mate. Your equal. Your queen." The words felt right on her tongue, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to speak them. They reached the borders of the moon court on the 8th day, as the sun set behind distant mountains and painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. Marcus stood at the crest of a hill, Isabella beside him, and pointed to a magnificent city of white stone that seemed to glow in the twilight. "Welcome home," Marcus said, taking her hand. Isabella stared at the city, at her future, at the place where she would either be accepted as Luna Queen or rejected as a human interloper. Fear and excitement warred in her chest, but when she looked at Marcus, saw the confidence and love in his golden eyes, she knew the truth. She was no longer Isabella Eastclaw, the enslaved maid who had nothing. She was Isabella Newmoon, mate of the Alpha King, and she had everything. But first they had to reclaim his throne. And face the ones who had stolen it. The throne room of the Moon Court had not seen its true king in 5 years, and when Marcus Newmoon walked through those doors with Isabella at his side, the assembled nobles fell silent with shock that bordered on terror. Dimitri stood on the dais, wearing a crown that had never been his to claim. He saw Marcus and went pale, his hand reaching instinctively for a weapon that wouldn't save him. The other traitors scattered throughout the room began backing toward the exits, but Marcus's loyal guards, those who had never stopped believing their king lived, blocked every escape route. By the ancient laws of succession, Marcus's voice rang out, carrying the weight of absolute authority. I challenge those who stole my throne. Face me or abdicate and accept exile. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Marcus fought with 5 years of rage channeled into surgical precision, and when it ended, Dimitri lay defeated at his feet. The other traitors bent their knees, begging for mercy they hadn't shown their king. Marcus stood over them, breathing hard, his golden eyes blazing. Isabella watched from beside the throne, her heart pounding, knowing this moment would define everything that came after. Would Marcus choose vengeance? Would the cycle of betrayal and violence continue? You will live, Marcus said finally, his voice hard as stone. But you are banished from these territories forever. If you return, you die. If you threaten my people again, you die. Now go and be grateful my mate taught me that mercy is not weakness. His gaze found Isabella then, and she saw the truth. He had spared them for her, because she had shown him a different way. When Marcus turned to address his court, Isabella stood and moved to his side. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable. They stood together as equals. The court erupted in scandalized murmurs. A human? As Luna Queen? It was unprecedented, impossible, an insult to werewolf tradition. Marcus silenced them with a single raised hand. This woman, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall, freed me when you abandoned me. She saw my soul when you saw only opportunity. She risked her life, sacrificed everything she knew, to save a creature she'd been taught to fear and hate. She is my mate, chosen by magic older than any of your prejudices. And she is your queen. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting any who would challenge him speak now or forever hold their peace. No one spoke. We will have a new treaty, Marcus continued, his hand finding Isabella's and gripping it tight. The Treaty of Two Bloods. Mixed territories where humans and werewolves live side by side, where old hatreds give way to new understanding. My queen will establish sanctuaries for enslaved humans, places of safety and freedom. Anyone who stands against this vision stands against me. 3 weeks later, Isabella stood in that same throne room, transformed beyond recognition. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that moved like water, and on her head sat a crown of silver and moonstone that caught the firelight from 1,000 candles. Her scarred hands, the same hands that had grasped burning chains, were adorned with rings that marked her as Luna Queen. Marcus stood beside her in his full regalia, looking every inch the Alpha King, but his eyes never left her face. The hall was filled with both species now, werewolves and humans, former enemies gathered to witness history being made. Isabella could feel their skepticism, their curiosity, their hope and fear in equal measure. He understood. She was asking them to believe in something impossible. But she had already done the impossible once. She stepped forward and the crowd fell silent. I was told I was nothing, Isabella began, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the hall. A slave. Property. Less than human. I spent 8 years believing those lies, accepting that my life would never be more than servitude and survival. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled crowd, meeting human eyes and werewolf eyes with equal directness. But nothing cannot love. Nothing cannot look at a chained wolf and see a suffering soul. Nothing cannot choose compassion over fear, freedom over safety, hope over hatred. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. I am something. I am your queen, your voice, your proof that what we are born as does not define what we can become. She held up her scarred hands, and in the firelight, everyone could see the marks where cursed chains had burned her flesh. These scars are my crown as much as the silver on my head. They are proof that breaking chains, whether made of iron or prejudice or fear, requires sacrifice. It requires courage. It requires believing that the world can be different than it is. Isabella turned to look at Marcus, and the love in his golden eyes made her heart swell. Your king and I stand before you as living proof that boundaries can be crossed, that enemies can become lovers, that hate can transform into hope. We offer you a choice. She looked back at the crowd. Continue the wars that have bled both our peoples dry, or choose something new. Choose peace. Choose understanding. Choose to see the soul beneath the skin, whether fur or flesh. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with possibility. Then from the back of the hall, a single human voice spoke up. A young woman who bore the marks of slavery on her wrists, much like Isabella's. I choose hope. Another voice joined hers. Then another. Human and werewolf alike, one by one they spoke their choice. Some voices were strong, some trembling, but all carried the same desperate desire for something better than the endless cycle of violence and fear. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes as she watched history being written in real time, watched the impossible becoming real before her eyes. When the ceremony finally concluded, when the crowds had dispersed and the candles burned low, Marcus led Isabella out onto a balcony overlooking the city. The moon hung full and bright above them, painting everything in silver light. How does it feel? Marcus asked softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. To be queen. Isabella leaned back against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong against her spine. Terrifying. Exhilarating. Right. She paused, then added, like coming home to a place I never knew existed. Marcus turned her to face him, his golden eyes searching hers with an intensity that still took her breath away. He took her scarred hand, the same hand that had grasped burning chains, that had bled to break his curse, that had chosen freedom over safety, and raised it to his lips. He kissed her palm gently, reverently, his lips warm against her damaged skin. These scars, he murmured against her hand, are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. They are proof of your courage, your compassion, your absolutely reckless love that saved us both. Isabella's breath caught as tears spilled down her cheeks. I would do it again. 1,000 times over, I would choose you. I know, Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. That's what makes you extraordinary. You saw a monster and chose to see the man. You saw chains and chose to break them. You saw an ending and chose to make it a beginning. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promises for all the tomorrows they would build together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. The chains are broken, he whispered. The Alpha King has risen, Isabella whispered back, completing the thought. And the maid who saw beyond fangs, Marcus finished, his eyes blazing with love and pride and fierce joy, has become the Luna Queen who will reshape the world. Far below them, the city of the Moon Court glowed in the moonlight, a symbol of everything they had fought for and everything they would build. In the shadows of the forest, both species were learning to live side by side, learning that old hatreds could give way to new hope. And in sanctuaries across the territories, enslaved humans were finding their way to freedom, following the path Isabella had blazed. The journey that had begun in a dark cell with stale bread and impossible recognition had transformed into something greater than either of them could have imagined. They had broken chains of iron and prejudice alike. They had proven that love could transcend species, that compassion was stronger than cruelty, that even in the darkest dungeons, hope could ignite a revolution. Isabella Eastclaw had been nothing, a slave with no future and no hope. But Isabella Newmoon was everything. A queen, a revolutionary, a living testament to the transformative power of seeing souls instead of surfaces, of choosing love over fear, of believing that the world could be different. The chains were broken. The revolution had begun. And nothing would ever be the same again. The chains are broken. The Alpha King has risen. And Isabella has become the Luna Queen who will reshape the world. But the story doesn't end here, and neither does your journey with me. If you want more tales of forbidden love, shattered chains, and souls that refuse to surrender, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my next video. Trust me, the next story will pull at your heartstrings just as fiercely as this one did. Drop a comment below. What moment in this story broke your heart or made it soar? I want to hear from my pack. The next adventure awaits. Will you join me? Subscribe now and I'll see you in the next story.